Welcome to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz. This episode we're going to be talking about the future of forest. Before we get into our discussion, let's take a look at the movie A Darker Shade of Green, Red Alert, The Future of Forest.
The state of Acre, Brazil, in the western Amazon, was once one of the most forested places on Earth. But the forests have been logged for precious hardwoods and to make way for vast cattle pasture to produce beef for the world market. Since 2006, Acre has had a state law implementing a program of payments for environmental services, and it is moving quickly to prepare the ground for REDD. But not everyone in Acre is at peace with these plans.
A natureza tem uma função, de fazer toda essa parte. E nós temos a função de proteger isso.
Nós estamos recebendo na nossa região mais um mecanismo que é o REDD. É mais uma engrenagem de mercado dos meios naturais.
Característica fundamental do REDD, ele tem que viabilizar.
In November 2011, people from throughout the Amazon and from other countries came together in Acre to discuss their concerns about REDD. They found that there are similar concerns everywhere.
O REDD para a gente não está sendo discutido com o movimento indígena. Ela não está sendo informado lá na aldeia do que é o REDD.
Agora, a destruição da floresta, a exploração dos povos que nela vivem, está um pouco mais sofisticada. Depois de legitimar e iniciar esse monumental saque da madeira, dessas florestas e de espoliação da população, agora vem uma outra forma ainda mais perversa, que é através dos mecanismos de REDD, que é para a comercialização do ar que se respira. Então é a mercantilização da natureza e de eliminação de qualquer possibilidade dos povos que aqui vivem, nessas florestas, terem um mínimo de autonomia para exercer o controle de seus territórios e para viver como gostariam de viver.
Praticamente 90% são afetados, são mulheres e crianças indígenas nesses impactos ambiental, com os grandes empreendimentos, com estrada, com hidrelétrica, com vários outros empreendimentos que tenha causado próximo da nossa terra ou dentro da nossa terra. E elas são as pessoas que não participam dos encontros, das oficinas, dos seminários que se trata a questão ambiental.
É um projeto que vem lá de cima para baixo.
A gente não é reconhecido por preservar a natureza, preservar a floresta, preservar a terra. Então, os povos indígenas, antes de surgir o REDD+, e outros REDD, já fazemos o REDD indígena, que é preservar a natureza. A questão da economia verde, nós vimos que a economia verde ela não serve para os povos indígenas.
Quem foi entrar no REDD hoje está aceitando a proposta da privatização dos meios naturais, está aceitando o mecanismo de mercadização da água, da floresta, da madeira, está aceitando a proposta do mercado dos meios naturais.
Welcome back to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz. We just saw sections from a movie put out by the Global Justice Ecology Project called A Darker Shade of Green, Red Alert, The Future of Forest. With me I have guest Jim Scheff, who is with Kentucky Heartwood, came all the way from Kentucky to St. Louis to talk with us today, because you were from the St. Louis area and are very familiar with the forestry issues in Missouri.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. Okay, now let me ask you, we just saw several minutes from A Darker Shade of Green. One of the things that they talked about is the green economy, and sometimes it goes by the name green capitalism, sometimes a Green New Deal, but all of these have as the assumption you can grow the economy and you can make the economy bigger as long as you do it in a sustainable, in a green way.
Right.
Now, what's wrong with growing the economy if you're concerned about forest?
Well, the problem is the economy, at least as it's currently devised, grows based on extracting resources from the environment, whether it's cutting timber or digging coal out of a mountain, and turning that into products that are bought and sold and eventually disposed of.
Am I correct that just about every extractive industry uses a lot of water?
Yes, yeah. And so you pull out these resources that are finite, and then you turn them through the machine of the economy, and then you throw them out. And there's only so much of these resources. And now a growth economy is based on the assumption that the rate at which that happens has to keep increasing and increasing and increasing.
So it's not a constant rate of increase, it's actually exponential. It's 2% this year, and then next year it's 2% on top of the 102% of the year, and then it multiplies, and the rate is actually increasing over time.
Well, I'm not an economist, but that's basically how it works. You know, if you listen to you know, when quarterly reports come out for Fortune 500 companies, they talk about how, you know, if they're not growing appropriately, then their stock gets devalued and the company can go bankrupt.
And so what we looked at in A Darker Shade of Green in the movie that we saw is it's this huge push right now, basically to destroy the last native forest that exists in the globe. Do you think that's a fair way to describe it?
Well, you know, the REDD agreement isn't intended to destroy those. It's meant as a way to try to save
so
those forests.
the REDD agreement does say that we're going to try to preserve the forest.
Right. On the surface, that's the goal.
Now tell me, what is REDD?
So REDD stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. And what it's talking about emissions is it's talking about greenhouse gas emissions. So what we're talking about is mostly carbon dioxide and then to some extent methane being released into the air and causing global warming, global climate change. And forests are like a sponge for carbon dioxide. They pull it out of the atmosphere. But when you cut forests, they release a lot of carbon dioxide. So forests can either pull that carbon dioxide out of the air and help mitigate climate change, or they can release it if they're logged. And so the idea under REDD is that polluting industries or polluting nations can then pay other nations or forest landowners in other countries to not cut their forest so that they don't release that extra carbon and they continue to pull that carbon out of the air. That's how it's supposed to work. But there's a lot of problems with the way that it's devised, so it might not actually achieve those goals.
Well, isn't it good that you reduce the pollution in the countries that are buying the carbon credits? That you would reduce pollution in the United States?
Well, that would be great if that's what happened, but that's not how it's devised. The idea with REDD is that those companies, for example, in the United States or other Northern Hemisphere countries, don't actually have to reduce their at least their greenhouse gas emissions. So a company can still release the same amount, but it would be cheaper under this model. It's cheaper for them to pay another country not to cut their forest than it is for the company to actually decrease the amount of carbon that they're putting out in the atmosphere.
So when the companies do this, we're looking at the northern countries, when they continue to pollute, are we only talking about greenhouse gases, or are there other things? If they're not reducing greenhouse gases, what other things are they not reducing also?
Well, that's part of the problem. So for example, when you burn coal, you release a lot of mercury into the atmosphere. For example, in the eastern United States, and where I live in Kentucky, a lot of the streams, you're not supposed to eat the fish because there's so much mercury in the food chain that you can develop mercury poisoning from eating too much fish from the streams. Well, that's coming from burning coal, and burning coal puts out a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. So if a coal company can buy their credits to these carbon credits to not decrease the amount of carbon they're putting out in the atmosphere, well, there's these heavy metals that are getting out in the atmosphere as well. And pretty much every industry, they're producing a number of different types of toxic compounds that can end up in the environment. And there's ways of cleaning it up, there's ways of doing better, but this is a way in terms of carbon to not decrease their production capacity.
Okay, and so basically what we're saying is that the issue of forest and the issue of greenhouse gases and the issue of toxic emissions they're all interconnected, and it's really not accurate to try to separate and deal with only one at a time because they all go together. Let's take a break and look at another segment from the movie, and then let's come back and talk about externalities. And keep that thought in your mind. What is an externality? We're going to take another look at a darker shade of green and be back in just a few minutes.
California is one of the richest places in the world. And at the same time, communities that live near sources of pollution are overburdened by those costs. Those costs come out in their health, in their enjoyment of the places where they live, work, play, and pray.
I was born and raised here in the North Richmond area, so I have experienced a whole lifetime of negative impacts from the Chevron refinery here. Waking up in the morning and finding leaves on the trees and flowers in the yard, burned crisp overnight from chemical exposure. From an environmental justice community perspective, we want polluting companies like Chevron here and others in our community to try not to produce the pollution in the first place and reduce it.
Incinerators, refineries, coal power plants that spew climate pollution should not be able to protect a forest and say that their job is done. They need to reduce their pollution, they need to pay the historic debt for all the externalized costs, the public health impacts, the ecosystem loss, the loss of clean air, the loss of clean water, the loss of livelihoods to all the communities that are most impacted.
Carbon offsets recreates the injustices that happen on a local level for communities that are overburdened by pollution, and puts those and externalizes those costs to communities that are similarly vulnerable outside of California.
In reality, it's a lot like trying to lose weight by paying someone else to go on a diet. And the idea is you give somebody else a bunch of money to lose weight, and you add your two weights together, divide by half, your average weight goes down if they lose enough weight. And in the case of some of the particular offsets, in particular the reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation proposals, it's a lot more like starving somebody someplace else as a way of losing weight.
While REDD is being rolled out all over the world, indigenous peoples and other forest-dependent people everywhere are speaking out against it.
Developed countries does not want to take responsibility to reduce carbon from GHG.
We indigenous people will be mostly affected negatively, very adversely by the REDD mechanism.
REDD is a market-based mechanism. It talks about market, it talks about a very different way of life about solving the climate crisis. It doesn't provide space for indigenous peoples to meaningfully take part in solving the climate crisis.
Supuestamente REDD es para uno de los metodologías para mitigar los impactos del cambio climático. Pero esta vez, a costilla de los pueblos indígenas, piensan hacer el bien supuestamente de la humanidad.
My people, the Kuna people, have probably 90% of the forest. And my understanding about the REDD, they cannot be part of the REDD program because they maintain the forest. They don't degrade the forest. They don't deforestate the forest. But what happened, you are creating perverse incentives when you are saying we're gonna pay to the people who deforestate or degrade. Then my people may say, okay, I want some cash here. I'm gonna deforestate my land. We cannot play with the rights of indigenous people like this.
Our rights, our ways, our knowledge are ignored by the government. Then what should we do?
Ensure the full and effective of participation indigenous people.
We must also to spread the what's the meaning of this REDD, what's the effect to our community and to our co-indigenous people.
Not only are forests being looked at as carbon sinks, but also as the renewable alternative to fossil fuels. Throughout the Global South, plans are underway to develop huge industrial tree plantations and to commercialize genetically engineered trees to produce biomass energy, industrial-scale biochar, and feedstocks for synthetic biology. This is all being promoted as the new green economy. Everywhere, these schemes are leading to land grabs, false promises, corruption, and conflict. And in many cases, they lead to more greenhouse gas emissions, not less.
If you're talking about Kalangala, you have seen oil palm and has gutted all the place, and as far as we can see, all the natural forest has been replaced. Mavira, the government is proposing to give it away. In the background, what you see here, the whole place has been degraded. You can see it is replaced with pine. So unless something is done to do with maybe replanting with natural species, I don't see the future of red in Uganda.
Entonces lo están promoviendo de que solamente el monocultivo es la solución para evitar o para mitigar los impactos del cambio climático. Entonces, si el día en que nosotros eliminamos todo tipo de bosques primarios en ese sentido, se acaba la diversidad biológica, se acaba el conocimiento tradicional, ya no vamos a utilizar la medicina indígena. O sea, entonces nos van a obligar realmente, ¿verdad?, a migrar a las ciudades, a las grandes ciudades.
No modifica la emisión, no genera desarrollo en las comunidades, genera más bien concentración de las tierras, exclusión y también expulsión de tierras campesinas indígenas en la medida que se va a convertir en un negocio, y oculta el verdadero problema en la verdadera raíz, que los países del norte, Europa, Estados Unidos, Japón, etcétera, emiten el 66% del CO2, y mientras no lo disminuyan, cualquier otro intento de disminuir será realmente una trampa.
Boleh hutan daerah sini dijadikan istilahnya hutan lindung atau apa ya, yang jelas untuk penghijauan dan segala macam, atau udara supaya istilahnya paru-paru dunia atau segala macam, itu silakan boleh. Cuman saya harap istilahnya untuk di luar negeri, pembuatan mesin dan lain sebagainya, itu justru istilahnya merusak, menyemarkan udara, itu kami harap ya harus di stop. Jangan istilahnya dilanjutkan. Jangan kita yang dijadikan korban sementara dia cuman mau ambil untungnya.
Welcome back to Green Time. I'm host Don Fitz. We just saw a segment from the great movie, A Darker Shade of Green, Red Alert, The Future of Forest. It's put together by the Global Justice Ecology Project. I have with me in the studio Jim Scheff with Kentucky Heartwood. And we were just talking about the economics, some of the problems of the REDD agreement, which claims to save forest, but doesn't actually do that. And the concept frequently comes in discussions of forest of externalities. What is an externality? What does that have to do with all the issues of pollution and forest that we've been talking about?
Right, well, an externality is something that a company doesn't have to pay for, but does have a cost. Mm-hmm. So, for example, earlier I mentioned coal pollution and mercury. Mm-hmm. So that mercury in the water has a real cost. It has a cost in people's inability to subsist off the fish. It includes the health impacts of people who eat the fish.
Right, and health impacts, so, that's really the way that the term originated, as I understand it, that 100 years ago, 200 years ago, when there first started to be labor unions, the employer would often say something like, well, if your hand is cut off by the machinery, that's your problem, I'm not going to pay for it. Yeah. And the labor union would want to say, no, if it happened at work, you need to pay for it.
Right, and that's how a lot of, this is really what a lot of pollution is. It's externalized costs. So as a society, we all had to pay for it. And as individuals, when we get sick from all these toxins in our body, we have to pay for it. But the company that's making a product that is putting these pollutants out into the environment, they're not having to pay for that. So they don't have to incorporate that into their bottom line and into their reports. They can show that they made a profit, but they're only making a profit because they're not actually having to pay the cost.
Are they externalizing the cost unto the worker or externalizing the cost unto the consumer?
Right, exactly, and we see that in forestry. So, for example, one of the things that forests do is they help filter water so that streams run clean. And so, when a forest is clear cut and the stream becomes silted, and that can denude the fisheries, and a lot of fish can die, and people can't subsist off those fish. Well, the timber company doesn't pay for that. So they can say they made a profit, but somebody else had to pay for it for them to make that profit.
And so actually it might be possible now that there's so much pollution, so much destruction from forestry, it's possible that the externalized cost could actually exceed the value of the product.
I think there's a lot of industries that, if they were examined very carefully, would turn out that way.
Yeah, they might make $1 billion in the product, but the cost to society might be $1.5 billion.
Right. There's been some good studies recently on the effects of mountaintop removal strip mining in central Appalachia on health impacts. And when you look at the health impacts, it's mind-boggling the financial cost of that.
Now, tell me, when we're talking about red in forest, one of the phrases that people frequently use with carbon trading is that it's a shell game. And of course, red is a form of carbon trading. What do people mean by a shell game?
Essentially, it means that it's a fraud. that you're sort of moving things around, pointing people to look over here, look over there, but you're not really doing anything. And so what they mean with red is it's the very real concern that it looks like a solution, it's being sold as a solution, they're getting people to buy into it as a solution to both carbon pollution, climate change, and deforestation, when the reality may very well be that it allows polluters to continue to pollute, and the forests that are supposed to be protected might not really be protected.
So you're just sort of moving environmental damage around and covering it up, but it's still there.
You're having people look at things, and meanwhile what's really going on is over here.
Okay, let me ask you this about green fuels. A lot of the forested areas are being changed over to grow things like soy and other things that can be palm oil, things that can be turned into fuels for automobiles. Isn't that a really good way for a poor country to help develop its economy?
Yeah, it's actually a horrible way. There's been a lot of good research in recent years looking at, this is called the biomass industry. It's about ways of taking plant material and turning them into fuels instead of fossil fuels. And originally it was sold as a great thing, because instead of taking fossil fuels, which are like oil and coal, out of the ground, it's using things that are growing using atmospheric carbon to turn into that plant, and then you turn that into something that you burn or turn into a fuel. And it's sold as being somewhat better. But a lot of these studies have come out and said that the actual carbon impacts, the climate impacts of trying to raise your fuel through agriculture are actually negative.
All right. Jim, we have less than a minute left, so I wanted to ask you, what about the green economy? What do you think of, is the green economy actually better?
It's better, but it's still heading in the same direction. And so when you have an economy that's based on consuming finite resources, consuming them more slowly only takes you to disaster a little more slowly.
It's sort of like if your airplane is going to crash and you go to the back of the airplane instead of the front, you can say that you can live a little longer. But in history, that the extra few years doesn't make a lot.
Right. We can use our resources, but we can't. But under the current paradigm, under the current system, it's going to be a train wreck.
Jim Scheff, thank you very much for coming to and joining us this episode of Green Time. I want to thank everybody for watching us, and tune in again this time next week.